The Kentucky sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting a golden hue over the empty stretch of road. Heat waves shimmered above the asphalt, the relentless summer air thick and heavy. Inside a sleek silver Mercedes, William Harrington tapped his thumb impatiently against the steering wheel, his lips pressed into a tight line. The soft hum of the air conditioner barely kept the oppressive heat at bay. At 78, William had lived a life of luxury, built from decades of success in finance. He was a man accustomed to control, to things running smoothly, to everything falling into place just as he planned. But today was an exception. The flat tire had come suddenly, the sharp jerk of the steering wheel making his heart lurch. He had pulled over, stepping out into the heat to confirm his suspicions. Sure enough, the right front tire sagged, deflated and useless. He had called roadside assistance, of course. That was the first thing he did. But after 3 failed attempts and nothing but static on the line, he realized he was in trouble. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, his phone had no signal. With a frustrated sigh, William leaned back against the car, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket to dab at the sweat beading on his forehead. He could feel irritation building in his chest. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. A man of his wealth, his stature, should never be left stranded on the side of a deserted highway like some ordinary fool. Just as the first flickers of true frustration began to set in, he noticed something, a figure approaching in the distance. At first, he wasn't sure if it was a trick of the heat, a mirage on the shimmering road. But no, it was real. A boy, maybe 13 or 14, walking toward him with an easy, steady pace. As the boy came closer, William took in his faded t-shirt, worn-out sneakers, and the dust clinging to his jeans. His clothes were simple, his shoes scuffed from use, yet his expression held a quiet confidence far beyond his years. The boy nodded politely as he stopped a few feet away, glancing down at the deflated tire before looking up at William. "Got a flat, sir?" he asked, his voice clear and steady. William exhaled, momentarily taken aback by the boy's composure. Yes, I do," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "I was hoping for a bit of help, but my phone isn't working out here." The boy smiled slightly, a calm, knowing expression crossing his face. "I can help with that." Before William could respond, the boy had already stepped forward, kneeling beside the car with quiet determination. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer," he added, running a hand over the rubber. "Do you have a spare?" William hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the trunk. He watched as the boy walked over, opened it with ease, and pulled out the spare tire and jack, his movements quick and efficient. For a moment, William considered offering to help, but something held him back. The boy worked with such quiet confidence, his hands moving with a precision and familiarity that felt out of place for someone his age. Standing there in the sweltering heat, William felt something unfamiliar, a sense of humility creeping in. He was used to being the one in control, the one with answers. But today, a boy in dusty sneakers was solving his problem with effortless ease. Minutes passed in silence, the only sounds being the scrape of metal against the pavement and the occasional grunt from the boy as he loosened the bolts and replaced the tire with expert efficiency. When he was done, the boy wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back, giving the tire a firm pat of approval. "All done," he said simply, offering a small, satisfied smile. William blinked, glancing from the perfectly secured tire to the boy standing before him. "That was fast," he muttered, momentarily at a loss for words. Then, recovering himself, he reached into his wallet, pulling out a few crisp bills and holding them out toward the boy. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help." But to his surprise, the boy took a step back, raising a hand politely. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Just happy to help." William stood there, money still in hand, watching in stunned silence as the boy turned and began walking away, just as calmly as he had arrived. For a long moment, he simply watched the figure grow smaller in the distance, disappearing into the heat of the sun-drenched road. Something about the interaction had left him unsettled, moved in a way he couldn't quite define. In his world, nothing came without expectation. Every favor, every deal, every act of generosity was given with something in return. But this boy had asked for nothing. As William climbed back into his car, placing the untouched bills back into his wallet, he found himself staring into the rearview mirror. The road stretched behind him, empty except for the fading silhouette of the boy. For the rest of the drive home, William's thoughts refused to settle. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by men who measured their worth in numbers, power, and influence. Yet here, on the side of a deserted road, a boy in worn-out sneakers had shown him a kind of wealth that couldn't be bought. The silver Mercedes glided smoothly through the iron gates of William Harrington's estate, the gravel driveway crunching beneath the tires as the evening sun cast long shadows over the pristine lawn. The mansion stood tall and imposing, a testament to his decades of wealth and success, a house filled with everything a man could ever want. And yet, as William stepped inside, the silence was deafening. He tossed his keys onto the marble entryway table and made his way to his study, loosening his tie as he walked. The room was just as it always was, polished mahogany shelves lined with books he rarely opened, a large leather chair positioned near the fireplace, and a heavy oak desk where he had spent countless nights making deals, reading financial reports, and securing his legacy. But tonight, none of it seemed to matter. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the ice clinking softly as he sank into his chair. He took a slow sip, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest, but even the familiar comfort of the drink couldn't settle the unease creeping into his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy, Jake Carter. The name suited him, simple, unassuming, but strong. The way the boy had handled the tire with steady hands, the quiet confidence in his voice, the way he had walked away without asking for anything in return, it all played in William's mind like a memory he couldn't quite let go of. Why had the boy refused the money? In his world, nothing came without expectation. Every favor, every kindness was part of a deal, a negotiation, an exchange. That was how business worked, how relationships were built in his circles. Even philanthropy, the grand donations he had made over the years, had always come with some level of recognition. A name on a plaque, a feature in a magazine, an invitation to an exclusive gala. But Jake? The boy had helped simply because he could, because it was the right thing to do. William leaned back, staring at the shelves of books he had once believed would bring him knowledge, power, and wisdom. They were symbols of his success, yet at that moment, they felt hollow, just like the rest of the house. He thought of the life he had built, a life of boardrooms and negotiations, of ruthless ambition and relentless pursuit of wealth. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted, the grand house, the luxury cars, the respect of his peers. Yet, here he was, alone in a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. When had he last done something for someone without expecting anything in return? He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't like the answer. His thoughts drifted again, to Jake's worn-out sneakers, his dirt-smudged hands, the way he had shrugged off the money as if it meant nothing. William had met thousands of people in his life, business partners, investors, employees, but very few who had genuinely surprised him. And Jake Carter, a boy from some small town, had done just that. And William needed to know why. Setting his glass down, he leaned forward, a familiar determination settling over him. He had spent his life solving problems, tracking down information, making things happen. Finding one boy in Kentucky shouldn't be difficult. Tomorrow, he would start searching. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of William Harrington's bedroom, casting a golden glow over the pristine space. He had barely slept. Jake Carter's face lingered in his mind, along with the unanswered questions that had kept him awake. By the time he finished his morning coffee, the decision had been made. He had to find the boy. Dressed in a crisp button-down and slacks, William slid behind the wheel of his Mercedes, retracing the same stretch of road where the encounter had taken place the day before. The landscape was just as desolate, rolling fields, the occasional rusted-out barn, and long stretches of highway without a single sign of life. His first stop was a small gas station a few miles from where he had been stranded. The place was old, its single fuel pump worn with age, and the paint on the sign faded from years of exposure to the sun. Inside, the scent of motor oil and freshly brewed coffee mixed in the air. The attendant, a man in his late 50s, looked up as William approached the counter. "Morning, need some gas?" William shook his head. "No, actually, I'm looking for someone, a boy, about 13 or 14. Wore a faded t-shirt and sneakers that had seen better days. Helped me change a flat tire on this road yesterday." The attendant furrowed his brows, thinking, "Can't say I know any kid like that. We don't get many folks passing through, let alone kids helping strangers." William nodded, offering a polite thanks before heading back to his car. He tried again at a small roadside diner, where the scent of bacon and biscuits filled the air. The waitress, a friendly woman with a name tag that read Linda, listened patiently as William described the boy. She shook her head. "I wish I could help, but that doesn't ring a bell. Sounds like a good kid, though." William was beginning to wonder if he would ever find him. Perhaps Jake had been just passing through. Perhaps their meeting had been nothing more than a fleeting moment, meant to come and go like so many others. But something inside him told him not to give up just yet. He made one final stop at a quaint little cafe on the edge of town. The place looked like it had been standing for generations. Wooden beams, checkered tablecloths, and the faint sound of an old radio playing in the background. A kind-looking older woman stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She greeted him with a warm smile. "What can I get for you, sir?" William hesitated for a moment before asking, "Actually, I'm looking for someone." A young boy, about 13, maybe 14. He helped me with a flat tire yesterday, out on the highway. The woman's eyes flickered with recognition. She placed her hands on her hips, tilting her head slightly. "Now, that sounds an awful lot like Jake Carter." William's pulse quickened. "You know him?" She nodded. "That boy is always helping folks, lives with his mama over in Harlan." Harlan. The name stirred something in William, though he had never been there himself. A small Appalachian town, an hour's drive from here. He thanked the woman, leaving a generous tip before stepping back into his car. As he pulled onto the highway, heading toward Harlan, he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for anymore. He told himself it was curiosity, a simple need to understand the kind of boy who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return. But deep down, he knew it was something more than that. This wasn't just about Jake. The road into Harlan wound through the rolling foothills of the Appalachians, flanked by dense patches of trees and weathered homes that had seen better days. It was a town that had endured, small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, a world apart from the pristine, polished life William Harrington had built for himself. As he drove down the main street, he passed mom-and-pop stores, an old gas station, and a few scattered houses with yards full of children's bicycles and laundry drying in the sun. It was humble, but it felt lived in. The directions he had gathered from the cafe led him to the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to a gravel driveway leading to a small, one-story house. It was old, but tidy. The porch sagged slightly under its own weight, and the paint on the siding was faded from years of sun and rain. A handmade wooden fence enclosed the front yard, though some of the boards were misaligned, a sign of repairs in progress. William parked his car, taking a moment to take in the surroundings. This was Jake's home, the boy who had walked away from money without hesitation, the boy who had helped a stranger, not because he expected something, but simply because he could. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and made his way toward the porch. Before he could knock, the door opened slightly, revealing a woman in her early 40s. She had tired eyes but a kind expression, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose bun. She wore a simple cotton blouse and jeans, her hands dusted with flour as though she had been baking. She eyed William cautiously, taking in his expensive clothes and the polished car behind him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but guarded. William cleared his throat. "Good morning. My name is William Harrington. I believe I met your son yesterday, Jake. He helped me change a flat tire." The woman's expression softened immediately. "That sounds like my Jake," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. William hesitated. "I just wanted to thank him properly. He wouldn't accept anything from me yesterday, and it didn't sit right with me." She nodded, stepping aside. "Well, you're welcome to wait for him. He's out back, fixing the fence." William followed her inside, stepping into a modest but well-kept home. The floors were clean, the furniture old but sturdy, and the walls were adorned with framed family photos and colorful hand-drawn pictures, the kind made with crayons and a child's imagination. A small table sat in the center of the living room, freshly baked bread resting on a cooling rack nearby, filling the house with a warmth that wasn't just physical. William felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, a quiet contrast to the sterile, oversized mansion he had left behind that morning. Rachel gestured toward the back door, leading him onto a small wooden porch that overlooked the backyard. There, in the afternoon light, was Jake. The boy was kneeling near the fence, hammer in hand, securing a loose wooden board in place. His hair was tousled from the heat, and his faded shirt had streaks of dust across it. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, and his blue eyes widened slightly when he saw William. "Mr. Harrington," he said, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Did you get another flat?" William chuckled, shaking his head. No, my tires are just fine today." Jake tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his expression. "Then, what brings you all the way out here?" William hesitated, feeling oddly out of place standing there in his tailored slacks and polished shoes, in a backyard that bore the marks of hard work and resilience. "I just wanted to thank you," he said finally. "You wouldn't take anything from me yesterday, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." Jake shrugged, the same easy, unaffected smile crossing his face. "It really wasn't a big deal." William stood on the wooden porch, the warmth of the afternoon sun casting long shadows over the small backyard. He watched as Jake set the hammer down, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. The boy's expression was calm, almost puzzled, as if he didn't quite understand why this man had driven all the way to Harlan just to say thank you. "You really didn't have to come all this way, Mr. Harrington," Jake said with a small smile. "It was just a flat tire." William folded his hands in front of him, feeling strangely out of place, surrounded by a world so different from his own. Maybe to you it was just a flat tire, but to me, it was something else entirely. Jake tilted his head slightly, curious but not pressing for answers. "You wouldn't take my money," William continued. "That's not something I come across very often?" Jake shrugged. "Didn't need it." William frowned, shaking his head slightly. "That's what I don't understand. Everyone needs money." Jake chuckled, leaning against the fence he had just been repairing. "Maybe, but not for everything. You needed help, so I helped. That's just what you do." His words were so simple, so effortless, yet they carried a weight that William couldn't ignore. Helping is just what you do. It was a sentiment William hadn't heard in years, perhaps even decades. His world had always revolved around transactions, exchanges, expectations. Even the charitable donations he had given over the years had always been accompanied by a plaque, a name in a program, or some recognition in a financial journal. But this boy, this kid who had so little, had helped him without a second thought, expecting nothing in return, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Rachel Carter stepped onto the porch then, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Jake, don't keep Mr. Harrington standing out here. Invite him to sit." Jake nodded, pulling an old metal chair from beside the fence and offering it to William. "You're welcome to stay for a bit," he said. William hesitated only briefly before lowering himself into the chair, watching as Jake sat cross-legged on the porch steps. Rachel leaned against the doorway, listening quietly. "You're good with your hands," William observed, nodding toward the fence. "Did you build that?" Jake grinned proudly. "Yeah, well, kind of. It was falling apart, so I fixed it up. We didn't have enough wood for it to match, but it holds up just fine." William glanced at the fence again, noting the mismatched boards, the uneven nails, the places where the wood had been sanded down to fit. It was far from perfect, but it was sturdy, reliable, functional, a reflection of the boy himself. "Do you like working with your hands?" William asked. Jake nodded. "Yeah. I like figuring out how things fit together, how to make them better." Rachel smiled proudly from where she stood. "He's been like that since he was little," she added, "always fixing things. If something breaks, Jake's the first to grab a toolbox." Jake shrugged, modest despite the praise. "I just like building stuff. Maybe one day I'll get to do it for real." William raised a brow. "For real?" Jake hesitated, as if unsure whether to say it aloud. "I want to be an engineer," he admitted. "I like designing things, fixing problems. I think it'd be cool to build something that really lasts." The words struck a strange chord in William's chest. It had been years, decades, since he had met someone who spoke with such genuine passion about their dreams. Most of the people he dealt with were already jaded, calculating, chasing wealth rather than fulfillment. But here was a boy with nothing but worn sneakers and a hammer, dreaming of building the world. William leaned back slightly, taking in the small, humble home. the rough edges of their life, the way Rachel watched her son with so much quiet pride. He thought of his own childhood, the tiny house his parents had worked so hard to keep, the way his father had taught him the value of hard work and perseverance. He had started with nothing once too, before the money, before the business, before the world had turned him into the man he was today. When had he lost sight of that? For the first time in a very long while, William felt something stir in his chest. Not pity, not obligation, but something far more personal. He wasn't just looking at a poor boy with a kind heart. William sat in the worn but sturdy metal chair, watching as Jake ran his fingers over the fence he had repaired. The boy's dream of becoming an engineer lingered in William's mind, intertwining with his own memories of youth, of ambition before wealth had shaped his life into something colder. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "I'd like to help you and your mother in any way I can," he said, looking between Jake and Rachel. "Maybe help with some repairs around the house, or..." Rachel held up a hand, smiling warmly but firmly. "That's kind of you, Mr. Harrington, truly, but we manage just fine." William studied her. There was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of bitterness or false pride, just a quiet resilience that spoke volumes about the kind of woman she was. She wasn't rejecting his help out of stubbornness. She was rejecting it because she had learned how to survive on her own. Jake didn't look surprised by her response. If anything, he seemed used to it, accepting of the way his mother carried their struggles without complaint. William hesitated, unused to being turned down. He wasn't a man who offered something twice. In his world, when he made an offer, people took it. But this wasn't his world, and for the first time, he found himself respecting the refusal. Rachel glanced toward the house, then back at him. "Would you like to stay for lunch?" she asked casually, as if inviting a billionaire into her humble home was the most natural thing in the world. William blinked, caught off guard. He almost declined out of habit. He had never been the type to linger. His schedule had always been tight, efficient, structured. Even before retirement, every interaction was about business, every meal a calculated engagement. But today he had nowhere more important to be. "I'd like that," he said, surprising even himself. Rachel smiled, gesturing toward the back door. "Come on in then." Inside, the Carter's kitchen was small but filled with warmth, the scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the aroma of roasted vegetables. A simple meal, but made with care. The wooden table had a few mismatched chairs, and the plates, though not fine china, were set with intention. Rachel moved with quiet efficiency, setting out food, while Jake washed up at the small sink. William took a seat, feeling strangely out of place, yet oddly comfortable. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. For the first time in years, William wasn't talking about investments, stocks, or business deals. Instead, he listened as Jake talked about his school, the subjects he liked, the ones he didn't. He talked about fixing things, about how he loved to figure out how they worked. Rachel shared stories of their small town, of neighbors who looked out for one another, of struggles that were faced with resilience and humor rather than complaints. William found himself drawn in, his sharp mind relaxing for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. There was a warmth in this house that his own mansion lacked. His estate had every luxury imaginable: high ceilings, marble floors, a dining table that could seat 20 guests. But it was empty. This house, it was full of life. As the meal ended, Rachel and Jake cleared the table together, moving in sync in a way that spoke of years of quiet teamwork. William sat back, his heart unexpectedly heavy. This wasn't about charity anymore. It was about honoring something he had forgotten. Jake's selflessness had stirred something in him, a reminder of a world where kindness existed without expectation, and William couldn't walk away without doing something in return. As he rose from his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves, he made a silent decision. He wasn't just going to help them. He was going to make sure that this boy, this bright, selfless kid, had every opportunity he needed to build the life he dreamed of. The decision had been made. As William Harrington drove back home, the wheels in his mind were already turning. He had spent a lifetime making things happen, closing deals, arranging investments, ensuring that every move he made yielded results. But this wasn't business, this was something personal. Jake Carter and his mother had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing, a glimpse into a world where kindness wasn't transactional, where people helped each other simply because it was the right thing to do. And William wanted to return the favor, not with a handout, but with something that truly mattered. By the time he reached his estate, he was already making calls. Old colleagues, contractors, suppliers. He had built connections over decades, and now, for the first time, he planned to use them for something other than profit. Within days, the plan was set in motion. 1 week later, trucks rumbled down the gravel driveway leading to the Carter home. Jake and Rachel stepped onto their front porch, eyes widening in disbelief as workers unloaded supplies: wood, shingles, fresh paint, new appliances. A team of contractors followed, scanning the house and making notes, already preparing for renovations. Rachel's hand instinctively went to her chest. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. William, standing beside his car, adjusted his cufflinks and offered a small smile. "It's my way of returning a favor." Jake's brow furrowed as he looked between the workers and William. "Mr. Harrington, you didn't have to do this." William met his gaze evenly. "Neither did you, that day on the road." Rachel shook her head, still struggling to process what was happening. "We manage fine, you know." William nodded. "I know, and that's what makes this feel right. This isn't about charity. It's about showing up for people who deserve it." Rachel's eyes glistened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she simply whispered, "Thank you." Jake, meanwhile, was already watching the workers with keen interest. They measured, they cut, they discussed blueprints and load-bearing walls. His eyes lit up as he took it all in, his mind visibly turning with questions. One of the contractors, a burly man named Tom, noticed Jake's fascination and chuckled. "You ever built anything, kid?" Jake grinned. "I fix things all the time." Tom nodded toward a pile of lumber. "Well, fixing is just building in reverse. You want to watch? Maybe learn a thing or two?" Jake looked to his mother, who hesitated only briefly before smiling. "Go on," she said. And just like that, Jake was in his element, trailing behind the workers, watching closely as they cut boards, mixed cement, and framed out the new fence. William watched from a distance, arms crossed, feeling a sense of pride that had nothing to do with numbers on a balance sheet. This boy, with his big dreams and quiet integrity, had no idea just how much he had already built. Not with hammers and nails, but with something even stronger: kindness, integrity, purpose. The renovation project moved quickly, the Carter home transforming before their eyes. What had once been a weathered house with a sagging porch and a mismatched fence was now coming together, stronger, sturdier, built to last. But for Jake Carter, the changes happening inside the house weren't the most exciting thing. It was the construction itself. The tools, the blueprints, the way each precise measurement and careful cut turned raw materials into something real. Every morning, before the workers arrived, Jake was already outside, eager to see what the day's work would bring. One of the contractors, a burly man named Tom Grayson, had taken notice. An old-school builder with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude, Tom had been working construction longer than Jake had been alive. And yet, when he saw the boy's wide-eyed fascination, he found himself grinning at the familiar spark of curiosity. One afternoon, as Jake stood watching him measure a wooden beam for the new porch railing, Tom raised an eyebrow. "You just gonna stand there, or you want to learn something?" Jake's eyes lit up. "Really?" Tom chuckled, handing him a measuring tape. "Here, tell me the length of this board." Jake took the tape measure carefully, pulling it across the wood. His fingers moved with precision, his gaze focused. 6 feet, 4 inches. Tom nodded. "Not bad, kid. Now, see this pencil?" He handed Jake a carpenter's pencil, its edges worn from use. "Mark that spot right there. Good. Now we cut." He guided Jake's hands over the saw, showing him the right angle, the right pressure. Jake hung on to every word, every motion, absorbing it like a sponge. And once the saw had sliced clean through, he looked up at Tom, beaming. "That was awesome." Tom smirked. "Careful, kid. You keep liking this, and next thing you know, you'll be building houses instead of just fixing fences." Jake laughed, but something in his eyes said he already knew this was what he wanted. As the days passed, his curiosity only deepened. He trailed behind the workers, asking questions about structural integrity, load-bearing walls, foundation stability. When they poured cement for the new front steps, he peppered them with questions about mixing ratios and drying times. When they rewired a light fixture in the kitchen, he wanted to understand how the circuit worked. And every time, the workers, tough men who weren't used to being teachers, found themselves explaining, showing, guiding. Because it wasn't every day you met a kid who actually wanted to learn. William watched all of this from a distance. At first he had assumed that Jake was just curious about the renovations, but the more he observed, the more he realized. This wasn't just curiosity. This was passion. Jake wasn't just watching. He was studying. He was absorbing everything, asking the kinds of questions that meant he was already thinking beyond just fixing things. William recognized that kind of hunger. It was the same drive that had once burned in him when he was young, before life had become about wealth and success. And for the first time, he saw clearly what Jake needed. It wasn't just a better home, it was an opportunity. That night, sitting in his study with a glass of scotch in hand, William made another series of calls, but this time, he wasn't arranging contractors. He was calling engineers, architects, builders, people who could give Jake something more than just a lesson with a saw. People who could give him a future. By the next morning, the arrangements were made. The final nails had been hammered, the last coat of paint had dried, and the sounds of construction had faded into memory. The Carter home, once worn and weathered, now stood strong. Sturdy walls, a freshly repaired roof, a brand new fence enclosing the yard. But it wasn't just a house that had been rebuilt. It was something deeper, something intangible. As Rachel Carter stepped onto her new porch, she exhaled softly, her gaze sweeping over the transformed space. The kitchen, once cramped and outdated, now had modern appliances and fresh countertops. The leaky roof was now sealed and secure, protecting them from the storms that used to find their way inside. Even Jake's bedroom had been repainted, a bright, hopeful blue, the color of possibility. She couldn't believe it, and she certainly hadn't expected what happened next. As word spread about the renovations, the neighborhood began to arrive, not empty-handed, but with small gifts, gestures of gratitude, signs of community. An elderly woman from down the street brought a fresh loaf of homemade bread, wrapped in a simple dish towel. A local farmer's wife arrived with a few jars of jam, smiling as she set them on the new kitchen counter. One of Rachel's longtime neighbors, a man who had lived in Harlan his whole life, handed her a small potted plant. "A new start for a new home," he said simply, tipping his hat before walking back down the gravel road. Rachel felt overwhelmed, not just by what had been given, but by what it meant. For so long, she had been used to carrying the weight alone, to standing on her own 2 feet without asking for help. But now, she saw how much people cared, how much kindness still existed in the world, and standing at the edge of the porch, watching it all unfold, was William Harrington. Rachel turned to him, her eyes shining with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." William shook his head, his voice quieter than usual. "You don't have to." She studied him for a long moment before she spoke again. "You changed our lives." William looked out over the house, the yard, the porch where Jake sat, legs swinging over the edge, watching the new fence with quiet pride. Then he turned back to Rachel, his expression unreadable for a moment before he said softly, "No. You gave me more than I gave you." Rachel didn't argue. She didn't have to. They both knew it was true. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jake found William standing near the fence, watching the last of the workers pack up their tools. The boy walked over, kicking at the dirt with his worn sneakers before glancing up. "So, this is it, huh?" William raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jake shrugged. "The house is done. The workers are leaving. You'll go home." William nodded, taking a deep breath. "I suppose I will." A brief silence stretched between them before Jake spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us." William turned, meeting his gaze. "Yeah?" Jake nodded. "I want to do something like that one day. I want to help people too." There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his eyes, just quiet determination, the kind William had only seen in people who truly meant what they said. Something swelled in William's chest, something he couldn't quite name. He placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder, his voice steady. "You already are, Jake." The boy frowned slightly. "How?" William smiled, a rare, genuine thing. "Because you started all of this, with one small act of kindness." Jake considered that for a moment before grinning, his usual easygoing nature returning. "Guess I did, huh?" William chuckled. "Guess you did." And as they stood there, watching the sunset cast long golden streaks across the sky, both of them knew this wasn't just an ending. The renovations were complete, the workers had long since packed up their tools, and the dust had settled. But William Harrington never truly left Harlan. What had started as a chance encounter on the side of the road had turned into something far more meaningful, something he never could have predicted. At first, he told himself that his visits were to check on the house, to make sure everything was holding up well. But with each trip, his purpose became clearer. He wasn't just coming back for the house. He was coming back for Jake Carter. Jake's interest in engineering only grew after the renovations. He devoured everything he could learn, reading books, watching tutorials, and asking endless questions. But the real turning point came when William introduced him to people who could truly help him grow. With a few well-placed calls, William arranged for Jake to shadow professionals, engineers, architects, and builders, people who had spent their lives designing and creating. The first time Jake stepped onto a real construction site, watching blueprints come to life, his eyes shone with excitement. "This is what I want to do," he told William one afternoon, his voice filled with certainty. "I want to build things that last." William smiled, nodding. "Then that's exactly what you'll do." And he meant it. As the months passed, Harlan became more than just a town William visited. It became a second home. He no longer arrived as an outsider in a luxury car that didn't belong on the worn streets. People knew him now. They greeted him with nods, with smiles. He had never cared much for community before, but now he understood its quiet power. He spent countless afternoons on the Carter's porch, watching as Jake excitedly explained a new concept he had learned, or as Rachel recounted small victories of the day with her easy warmth. And one evening, as the golden light of sunset stretched over the hills, William sat in a rocking chair on the newly built porch, sipping a glass of iced tea that Rachel had set beside him. Laughter echoed around him, Jake's voice carrying as he joked with some neighborhood kids, Rachel's soft chuckle as she listened. He had spent his whole life chasing wealth, power, influence. He had built a fortune, but somehow it had never felt this full, this complete. Now, sitting here, surrounded by the simple, honest joy of real connection, he finally understood. Happiness wasn't in money. It wasn't in the deals, the negotiations, the endless pursuit of more. It was in giving, in showing up, in making a difference. One small act of kindness, a boy stopping on the side of the road to help a stranded man, had set all of this in motion. He looked over at Jake, who was explaining something animatedly to one of the kids. There was no doubt in his mind. This boy was going places. And this time, William wasn't just an observer. He was part of it. He had found something greater than wealth, greater than success. He had found purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake turned to him, grinning. "You sticking around for dinner, Mr. Harrington?" William chuckled, shaking his head. "Call me William." Jake's grin widened. "All right, William, you sticking around?" William leaned back in the rocking chair, letting the warmth of the moment settle in. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, certain. "I think I will."